Research Institute. Max, consider the red carpet firmly rolled out here for the Russian leader.
Yes, certainly, and thank you for having me. I think this is really a very important visit for Putin. It's only the third visit we've seen him make outside Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February after Iran and China, and really Saudi Arabia and the UAE are on that level of importance for Russia. The UAE is particularly important for Putin ahead of his presidential re-election next March, and I use air quotes very tightly there. It will not be a contested election, but he still wants to show domestically that he's accepted in a major international trade and finance hub like the UAE. And then for Saudi Arabia, that's of course the key partnership in OPEC Plus, which I've argued is Putin's most significant geopolitical and geoeconomic success over the last 10 years, and which I think will be particularly important for his strategy going into 2024 as well.
So what do you believe Putin actually discussed with the leaders of UAE and Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think, we've seen the Kremlin really try to message that not only was oil cooperation and the continued operation of OPEC Plus on the agenda, but also concerns about sanctions. I think that in particular with the UAE, he's trying to send the signal that sanctions will not be applied here. And I think the UAE has been pretty happy to accept that message, and Saudi Arabia very much is as well. One of the sort of really interesting things we see is in his entourage, which includes people like the Chechen strongman and commander on the battlefield in Ukraine, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is, of course, himself under sanctions, but also the head of the Russian Central Bank, Elvira Nabiullina, who is ostensibly not in charge of any of the direct trade policy or oil issues, but really gets to the message that the Kremlin is trying to signal that those sanctions on its central bank, the really devastating so-called nuclear option that was used after the full-scale invasion last year, are relatively limited, and that the Kremlin has ways to push back. I don't expect that we'll get from Saudi Arabia some kind of direct announcement that there was any discussion about, for example, what the Kremlin really wants, which would be establishing a market to sell more oil outside of the dollar system. But the Kremlin does really want to send that message, and I think Western capitals will be particularly attuned to the fact that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have hosted him in this environment.
Indeed, Max. And one of the other interesting things here to consider is exactly what the White House is thinking and how President Biden might respond. There is a view in some corners that perhaps the growing ties that we see between Russia and the Gulf states could present a strategic threat to the US's interests in the region. What's your view?
I think that, there's a lot of real concern there. When we consider the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean region more broadly, particularly amid the conflict in the Gaza Strip, the Kremlin often acts as a sort of reactionary power and is willing to make new friendships and new ties at short notice to try to boost its interests and weaken those of the West. But of course, in Saudi Arabia, the relationship with MBS in particular has been one that Putin has cultivated since MBS first rose to power in 2015, where I think there's a lot more trust and one could even say understanding between those two leaders than there is between Biden and MBS, for example. So this is something that the U.S. really does need to be concerned about, because the amount of leverage that Russia has not only in the region but in turn over oil markets are the kind of things where I expect we'll see pressure points going into 2024 as Russia continues to use its economic weapon and to seek economic points of leverage to mitigate and minimize Western support for Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia.
And Max, just finally, against the backdrop of a new conflict in our region between Israel and Hamas, the Russian president is going to be meeting with the Iranian leader. What should we expect?
I think there we'll see some strong messages of support between Iran and Russia for one another. They have, of course, vastly expanded an already relatively deep level of defense cooperation since Putin's full-scale invasion, including joint development of drones, which Iran in turn supplies to allies such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthi movement in Yemen, which are its real abilities to sort of escalate that conflict. But I think that Putin will also be trying to support the Iranian narrative that it is not directly involved and potentially lead to more tensions between Russia and Israel, which is a matter that Putin needs to balance, in particular because he's often tried to stop Israel and to pressure Tel Aviv into not supporting Ukraine more overtly.
Max, fascinating geopolitical, geoeconomic backdrop to be discussing. We're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. But thanks for joining us today. That's Max Hess from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Up next on the program, JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon lashes out at cryptocurrencies as Bitcoin continues to stay near 44,000. We'll tell you about that on the other side of this.